The poor boy's arms locked tightly around the billionaire's son's neck, his small frame trembling as he dragged the unconscious child out of the mud. Rain poured down like needles, soaking his torn shirt, mixing blood and dirt into the puddles at his feet. "Hold on. Please don't die," he whispered, his voice breaking as he stumbled through the storm. Moments ago, the luxury SUV had skidded off the road, spinning, screaming, and landing nose first in the swamp. The bodyguards had fled for help. The chauffeur was gone, but the boy, the one no one had ever noticed, had seen the crash from across the field. Now, his bare feet slipped through the mire as he pulled the billionaire's son closer, shielding him from the downpour with his frail body. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. Lightning flashed, illuminating the child's pale face, lifeless. "Cold and still, come on, breathe," the boy cried, pounding on the boy's chest with desperate hands. And then, a cough, a weak gasp. The billionaire's son, the one who had never known struggle, never touched mud, opened his eyes and looked up at the boy who had just saved him. That night, beneath the roaring storm and broken headlights, two worlds collided, one born of privilege, the other of pain. Neither of them knew that this moment would change everything. If you believe kindness still matters, if your heart moves when you see humanity rise above hate, then stay till the end of this story. Because what happens next will remind you that heroes don't always wear suits. Sometimes they're barefoot, covered in mud, and forgotten by the world. The next morning, the city of Charleston woke to headlines that rippled through every news channel and social feed. Billionaire's only son rescued by local boy during storm. But while the world saw a headline, Jamal Carter saw only mud still drying on his hands. He hadn't gone viral yet. He didn't even know the name of the boy he had saved. All he remembered was the weight, not of the child, but of the moment. The panic in those small, trembling arms around his neck as he pulled him free from the sinking ditch. The way the rain had drowned out the boy's screams, until there was only silence and Jamal's desperate heartbeat. That boy was Ethan Walsh, the 9-year-old son of billionaire Richard Walsh, the man whose name was printed on hospitals, schools and luxury towers across the East Coast. And Jamal was a nobody, a 13-year-old from the wrong side of the river, where roofs leaked, shoes tore, and dreams didn't survive long. He hadn't expected anything in return. When he had seen the car overturned in the mud that night, half submerged under the raging rain, he didn't think. He just ran, barefoot, cold heart pounding, and when he had finally pulled the boy out, he whispered, "You're safe, little man. You're safe now," before collapsing beside him in exhaustion. That morning, Richard Walsh's private security tracked Jamal down. They found him sitting outside an old community shelter eating dry bread. "Are you the boy who rescued Mr. Walsh's son?" one of them asked. Jamal froze. His first instinct was fear. People in black suits didn't come to his neighborhood unless something bad had happened. I didn't do nothing wrong," he stammered. The guard looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "No, kid. You did something right, within hours." Jamal was brought to the Walsh estate, a sprawling mansion overlooking the river he had grown up beside but never crossed. When he stepped inside, he felt smaller than ever. The marble floors gleamed like mirrors. A chandelier hung from the ceiling like 1,000 stars, and in the center of the grand hall stood Richard Walsh himself, tall, composed, but with eyes that carried the sleepless weight of a father who'd almost lost his only child. Ethan, bandaged but smiling, ran forward. "Dad, that's him! That's the boy who saved me!" Richard's gaze shifted to Jamal, this skinny, barefoot kid with clothes still stiff from dried mud. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard extended his hand. "Son," he said quietly, "you saved my world." Jamal didn't know what to say. His throat tightened. I just didn't want him to die, sir." Richard's jaw trembled slightly. He knelt down, looked Jamal straight in the eyes and said, "I owe you a debt I can never repay." But Jamal just shook his head. "You don't owe me, sir. I just did what anyone should have done." The truth, though, was painful. Not everyone would have done what Jamal did. The people who had driven past that road that night had seen the wreck, they'd slowed down, maybe even whispered, "Poor kid," before driving off into the storm. Jamal didn't. And that's what made all the difference. Over the next few days, the Walsh family tried to reward Jamal, a scholarship, new clothes, a bank account in his name. But Jamal refused most of it. He only accepted a pair of shoes, because mine got lost in the mud, he said with a shy grin. Ethan and Jamal became inseparable after that, one from the richest home in the city, one from the poorest street, and yet, somehow, they understood each other better than anyone else. But what Jamal didn't know was that his act of kindness had set in motion something far greater than a friendship. Because Richard Walsh, the billionaire, wasn't a man easily moved by emotion. He had seen greed, betrayal, and people who pretended to care only to get close to his money. But Jamal was different. That night, as Richard stood by his son's bedside, watching Ethan sleep peacefully for the first time since the accident, he made a quiet decision. He picked up the phone and said to his assistant, "I want every detail about that boy's life. Where he lives, what school he goes to, everything." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, if this is about charity," Richard interrupted, "this isn't charity. This is justice, because in a world where power belonged to money, Richard had just met a boy who reminded him what true worth really meant." 3 days after the storm, the sun finally returned to Charleston. But for Jamal Carter, life hadn't gone back to normal. He stood outside the shelter's gates, staring at the stretch of road where luxury cars occasionally slowed, then disappeared into the distance. In his hands, he still held the note that Richard Walsh's assistant had given him before they left that morning. "Mr. Walsh would like to meet you again, tomorrow evening." Jamal wasn't used to being invited anywhere, especially not to a mansion. The last time he had entered one, it was to fix a garden fence with his uncle, and even then, they had been told not to touch anything. But this was different. This time, the richest man in the city wanted to talk to him. That evening, Jamal walked the long driveway up to the Walsh estate again. He wore the same second-hand shirt he always did, freshly washed, but frayed at the collar. The guards greeted him politely this time, not with suspicion, but with respect. One even smiled, saying, "The boss has been waiting for you, kid." Inside, Richard Walsh sat by the fireplace, a folder open before him. He looked older in the glow of the flames, not the confident billionaire from magazine covers, but a man whose world had been shaken. "Come in, Jamal," he said gently. "Sit down." Jamal obeyed, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Richard studied him for a long moment. "You know, I've spent my life around people who smile when I walk into a room, and lie the moment I turn around." He leaned forward. "But you ran into the storm for a stranger. Why?" Jamal hesitated. "Because I know what it's like to be stuck, sir." Richard blinked, surprised. Jamal looked up, his voice trembling. "When my mom got sick last year, we didn't have money for a doctor. People saw us, they knew, but nobody stopped. They just kept walking. So when I saw your boy's car sinking, I couldn't walk away." Silence filled the room. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire. Richard slowly closed the folder. "I did some checking, Jamal. Your mother's name is Denise Carter, right?" Jamal nodded. "She passed away last winter," Richard said softly. "And your father?" "Never met him, sir." Richard exhaled, his eyes darkening with something between pity and guilt. "I'm sorry, son." Jamal looked away. "It's okay, sir. She always said God gives the hardest roads to the strongest feet." Richard smiled faintly. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Jamal whispered. Over the following weeks, Richard began visiting Jamal more often, sometimes bringing books, sometimes just sitting with him at the shelter, asking about school or life. But one day, Richard arrived with an envelope. "Jamal," he said, "how would you feel about coming to live here and with us? I've spoken with the Child Services Department. You'd have your own room. You could go to the best school in the city. Ethan's been asking for you every day." Jamal froze. His mind raced. "Live here? In the Walsh mansion?" His heart said yes instantly, but his pride whispered something else. I don't know, sir. This place isn't for people like me," Richard frowned. "People like you? Jamal swallowed. Poor kids, sir. Kids who come from nothing. Richard leaned back, his gaze soft but firm. Son, character isn't about what you have. It's about what you do when you have nothing, and I've never met anyone wealthier in heart than you. For the first time, Jamal saw something in Richard's eyes. Not charity, but respect. He nodded slowly. If it's really okay, then yes, sir. I'd like that, Richard smiled. Good, then welcome home. Jamal. The days that followed were like something out of a dream. Jamal had his own bed, soft and warm. 3 meals a day that didn't come from a shelter kitchen. And for the first time in years, he heard laughter at the dinner table, his and Ethan's echoing together through the marble halls. But while Ethan's laughter was pure, the world outside was not. It didn't take long for whispers to start. Did you hear? The Walsh boy's new friend is from the projects. Imagine, a billionaire adopting a street kid. Must be for publicity. Reporters began circling, hungry for a story. One even tried to sneak a photo of Jamal leaving school, shouting, "Hey kid, how much does the old man pay you to play hero?" Jamal didn't answer. He just lowered his head and walked on, because he'd promised Richard he wouldn't lose his temper. But that night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, looking out at the river, and whispered to himself, "I didn't do it for fame. I just wanted to help." Down the hall, Richard stood by the doorway, watching. He'd heard everything, and it broke him, because in Jamal's pain, he saw his own reflection from years ago, when he too had been a poor kid fighting a rich man's world. 1 week later, the tension finally exploded. Richard had hosted a charity dinner, the city's elite. Journalists, politicians, everyone who mattered. And Jamal, dressed in a suit Ethan had helped him pick out, stood quietly near the back, unsure where to belong. That's when Victoria Langford, a wealthy investor's wife, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Well, isn't that adorable, Mr. Walsh's little charity project?" Laughter rippled through the room. Jamal froze. His chest burned, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the noise, calm, commanding, and sharp as thunder. Enough. It was Richard. The room went silent. He stepped forward, eyes locked on Victoria. "You find it amusing that this boy saved my son's life? That he risked his own without asking for a cent? Tell me, Victoria, when was the last time you did something without expecting applause?" Her face flushed crimson. Richard continued, his voice steady but rising with emotion. "You mock him for being poor, but that boy's courage is worth more than all your diamonds combined." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Richard turned to Jamal, his tone softening. "Son, don't ever let their words make you feel small. You stood tall when grown men ran away." Jamal felt his throat tighten. The hole blurred. He managed a whisper. "Thank you, sir." Richard smiled faintly. "No, Jamal, thank you. You reminded me what real worth means." That night, after the guests left, Richard called Jamal into his study. "Do you know why I let them see you here tonight?" he asked. Jamal shook his head. "Because the world doesn't change through silence," Richard said. "It changes when someone like you walks into a room full of power and doesn't bow." He handed Jamal a small wooden box. Inside was a watch, old, scratched, but clearly precious. "This was my father's," Richard said. "He gave it to me when I was your age." "I want you to have it." Jamal's eyes widened. "Sir, I can't—" "You already earned it," Richard interrupted. "You reminded me of the man I used to be." Outside, the rain began to fall again, softer this time, not angry, but cleansing. Jamal looked at the watch in his hands, then at the man who had once seemed like a distant giant, now just another human being standing in front of him. And for the first time, Jamal understood what his mother had meant when she said, "The strongest feet walk through mud to teach others how to stand tall." The boy who had nothing had just changed everything. The next morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. The storm had passed, yet something heavier hung in the air, something unspoken. Jamal awoke early, slipping into the hall before anyone else stirred. He could still hear Richard's words echoing in his mind from the night before. You reminded me of the man I used to be. He didn't fully understand what Richard had meant. Not yet, but he was about to. As Jamal wandered toward the library, he heard voices, muffled but tense. Richard was speaking with someone over the phone. Yes, I'm aware of the risk, Richard said, pacing slowly. But I can't keep this hidden any longer. If the board finds out from someone else first, it'll destroy everything. There was a pause. Then Richard's tone softened. I owe it to him. The boy deserves the truth. Jamal froze outside the door. The truth? Before he could think, the floor creaked beneath his foot, and Richard turned sharply. Jamal? You're up early, the boy hesitated. Sorry, sir. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. Richard sighed, motioning for him to come in. It's okay. Maybe it's time you heard this anyway. He gestured for Jamal to sit, then opened a small drawer from his desk. Inside lay a stack of faded letters, some brittle with age. Jamal, you remember when I told you I grew up poor? Jamal nodded. Well, that wasn't the whole story. He took a deep breath. I was born on the south side of Chicago. My father worked in a steel mill. My mother cleaned houses, sometimes for families who wouldn't even look her in the eye. We didn't have much, but what we had we earned. When I turned 18, I promised myself I'd never be poor again. And I kept that promise, but at a cost. Jamal leaned forward. What cost? Richard stared into the fire, the reflection of the flames dancing in his tired eyes. I built my company from the ground up. But to do that, I made choices, cruel ones. I crushed smaller businesses. I turned away people who begged for help. I became the same kind of man who once looked down on my parents. He swallowed hard. And when my wife died, I drowned myself in money. Tried to fill the hole with everything that glitters, but it never worked. Jamal stayed silent, listening. Then Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. And that day when you pulled Ethan out of the mud, when you looked at me with those eyes full of kindness, it broke something inside me. Because you reminded me of the boy I once was, he paused. And of someone else, Jamal frowned. Someone else? Richard picked up one of the old letters and handed it to him. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded. It read, Dear Richard, I know you'll never forgive me, but I had no choice. Our baby deserves a better chance at life than I can give him. Please, take care of him. Denise Jamal's hands trembled. His eyes darted up to Richard, confusion flooding his face. My mom's name was Denise, he whispered. Richard nodded slowly. I know, son. The words hung in the air like thunder. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. What are you saying? Richard's voice cracked. I'm saying she wasn't just your mother. She was my wife's sister, your aunt, which makes you... Jamal's eyes widened. Family? Richard nodded, tears glistening. Yes, Jamal, my blood. My sister-in-law left you at a shelter years ago because she was too sick and too proud to ask for help. And he swallowed hard. I never knew. Not until after she died. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with everything they'd both lost, everything they'd both been searching for. Jamal finally whispered, Why didn't you tell me before? Richard's voice broke. Because I was ashamed. I thought you'd hate me for not being there when she needed me. For not finding you sooner. I wanted to earn the right to be your family first, not just claim it. Jamal's throat tightened. He looked down at his hands, small, trembling, holding the letter that had just rewritten his life. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I don't hate you, sir. Richard blinked, stunned. I was angry at the world for a long time, Jamal continued. But maybe the world was just trying to lead me back to where I was meant to be. Richard's eyes filled. You mean that? Jamal nodded. Yes, sir. I mean it. For a long moment they just sat there, an old man and a boy, bound by fate, forgiveness, and a second chance neither of them expected. Then Richard stood, reaching into his desk once more. He took out a sealed document and placed it on the table. This, he said quietly, is a legal transfer. Half of my foundation will be under your name one day. It's not charity, it's legacy. Jamal shook his head, stunned. I can't take that. Richard smiled. You already did, the moment you saved my son. A week later, The story broke in the news. Not about the billionaire's money or his mansion, but about the boy who had changed him. Headlines read, "From Mud to Miracle. Orphaned boy inspires billionaire to build homes for the poor." The cameras showed Richard and Jamal standing side by side, not as benefactor and beneficiary, but as equals. And behind them, the first groundbreaking began for the Denise Carter Home Foundation, a housing project named after Jamal's mother, to help struggling families start anew. But while the world saw philanthropy, inside that mansion, something even more powerful was happening. A family was healing. Ethan now called Jamal brother. They played basketball in the courtyard, chased each other through the halls, and sometimes, when the rain fell, they'd just sit by the window, watching it pour. "Do you still hate storms?" Ethan asked one day. Jamal smiled faintly. "Not anymore. Storms don't always destroy things, Ethan. Sometimes they wash the truth clean." Months passed. On a crisp autumn evening, Richard gathered his small family in the study. The fireplace glowed again, the same one where he'd once confessed everything. He looked at the two boys before him, one by blood, one by heart, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. "Life," he began softly, "isn't measured by what you own, but by who stands beside you when the rain comes." Jamal smiled. "And who pulls you out of the mud?" Richard laughed through tears. "Exactly." He raised his glass of cider, hand trembling slightly. "To storms, and to the people who survive them together." They clinked glasses. Three hearts connected not by wealth or race or power, but by something far stronger: grace. Outside, the sky rumbled again, a distant echo of the storm that had started it all. But this time no one was afraid, because they all knew. Some storms come not to break us, but to bring us home. The hospital room was quiet now. Only the slow, rhythmic beep of the monitor filled the air. Calm, steady, alive. Ethan, the billionaire's son who had once been trapped in that freezing, muddy ditch, was breathing again. His small chest rose and fell gently beneath the white sheets. Sunlight poured through the blinds, casting gold over his pale face. Beside him sat Marcus, the poor black boy who had saved him. His torn jacket was still damp from the storm, his hands bruised, his eyes heavy from 2 sleepless nights at the hospital. But he didn't move. He just watched Ethan, afraid that if he blinked, the miracle might fade away. The door opened. Richard Langford, Ethan's father, one of the richest men in the state, walked in quietly. His $1,000 shoes made no sound on the marble floor. His face, usually sharp and cold, was softer now, broken in a way money could never fix. He stopped at the foot of the bed, and for a long moment he couldn't speak. Marcus stood, nervously pulling at his sleeves. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to trespass. I just saw him in the mud and—" But Richard raised his hand. His voice cracked. "Son, you saved my boy." For a man who had bought everything in life, politicians, companies, silence, it was strange to see his lips tremble as he stepped closer to a child from the slums. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box and held it toward Marcus. Inside, a diamond watch, worth more than everything Marcus's neighborhood had combined. But Marcus shook his head. "I don't want your watch, sir. I just didn't want him to die." Those words hit Richard harder than any storm. For the first time in years, he looked at someone and didn't see skin color, class, or worth. He saw heart. He slowly knelt, a billionaire on his knees before a boy who owned nothing. "Then maybe it's me who needs saving," he whispered. A nurse appeared at the door. "Sir, Ethan's waking up." They both turned. The boy's eyelids fluttered, his lips forming a faint smile. "Dad?" Richard rushed to his side, gripping his son's hand. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here." Ethan blinked weakly, then turned his head toward Marcus. Did I die?" Marcus chuckled softly. "Almost. But you're tougher than you look." Ethan smiled. Small, fragile, but real. Then, in a tired whisper, he said something that silenced the room. "Dad." "He's my brother now, okay?" Richard froze. The words were simple, innocent, but they cracked open something inside him. He looked from Ethan to Marcus, and without hesitation, he nodded. Yeah, he is. Days turned into weeks. Ethan recovered faster than the doctors expected, and one crisp morning, a black limousine pulled into a small, forgotten neighborhood on the city's south side. From it stepped Richard Langford, dressed in his tailored suit. But this time, no guards, no press. Just him. He knocked on the door of a rundown apartment. Marcus's mother opened it. Tired eyes, worry carved into every wrinkle. Before she could speak, Richard took off his hat. Mom, I owe your son my life. I owe you both more than I can ever repay. She hesitated. Sir, we don't need your charity. This isn't charity, he interrupted softly. It's family. He handed her an envelope. Inside, papers that would change their lives forever. A full scholarship for Marcus, a new home, a trust fund in both boys' names. Not as gift and debt, but as equals. Her eyes welled up. She tried to speak, but Richard shook his head gently. Your son reminded me that some things money can't buy. Honor, courage, heart. And for the first time in years, he smiled. A real one. Months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the Langford estate echoed not with silence, but laughter. Ethan and Marcus were running across the lawn, splashing in the fountain, chasing a soccer ball. Two boys, one once trapped in privilege, the other in poverty, now side by side, unchained from both. Richard sat on the porch watching them, the sun glinting off his coffee cup. Beside him, Marcus's mother joined him, smiling shyly. You really think they'll stay close? She asked. Richard nodded slowly. They already are. You see, sometimes the storm doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to wash the dirt off your soul. The camera slowly pans up to the golden sky, the mansion, the laughter, the warmth, a picture of what humanity can look like when compassion wins. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness and courage still exist, then please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories that celebrate what truly makes us human.